Good evening and welcome to Wilson Hall Auditorium. Please take a moment to locate your nearest emergency exit, and at this time, please stop texting and turn off your cell phone. Thank you, and enjoy the presentation.
Good evening. It's great to have you here. I'm John Alger, president of James Madison University, and I want to welcome all of you to our first in-person Madison Vision Series event in over 2 years. What a great moment to get to this point. So as many of you know, the Madison Vision Series provides an opportunity for our community to explore major public issues of our time. We hope to stimulate thought, discussion, and action with a variety of speakers, perspectives, and disciplines. Tonight's guest was originally scheduled to join us in April of 2020. I think you all know what happened around that time. So, of course, we needed to postpone that event, and at the time, we were extremely disappointed. Yet, fast forward now to here we are, April of 2022, when apparently we still have snow, as you all saw today, but it now seems fortuitous that Farah Pandith can join us at this moment in time, given the rapid changes and ongoing conflict in the world. She brings a unique and important set of experiences and perspective to challenges we face today. First, Farah Pandith is a dynamic and inspiring thought leader. She's a foreign policy expert and renowned pioneer in countering violent extremism. She served Presidents George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama within the National Security Council, Department of State, and U.S. Agency for International Development. She also served both Secretaries Hillary Clinton and John Kerry as the first ever special representative to Muslim communities, traveling to 80 countries, conducting grassroots work, and meeting with young people, women's groups, and global NGOs. She was the main architect of the Women in Public Service Project, a global movement launched at the U.S. Department of State in 2011 to accelerate women's equal participation in policy and political leadership. Now a senior fellow at the Future of Diplomacy Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a senior advisor for thought leadership at the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream. Ms. Pandith is a strong advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion at all levels, believing that direct personal interactions are the best way to discover and integrate other perspectives. We're in good company here, as Ms. Pandith has also spoken at the United Nations, the World Bank, the House of Lords, and the European Union. Of course, she's among dukes tonight, right? That's sort of royalty. Among other government organizations, companies, and universities around the world. She's also appeared regularly on dozens of television programs, including the BBC, Bloomberg, CNN, PBS NewsHour, CBS News, Face the Nation, and ABC's This Week and 2020. She's also the author of this book right here, How We Win, How Cutting-Edge Entrepreneurs, Political Visionaries, Enlightened Business Leaders, and Social Media Mavens Can Defeat the Extremist Threat. Now, this is available, by the way, through Amazon and whatever your favorite service is to get books, so do check out a copy. It's a book that takes a fresh look at the centuries-old problem of how to engage with those in the world whom we often see as the other, and perhaps even the enemy. The book combines amazing stories with practical insights and wisdom, and I strongly recommend it. You will see here that Farah, and you'll hear it tonight as well, but that practical wisdom about how you engage with other people who seem to be very different from you, it really comes through in this book. We thought it would be most engaging this evening to use more of a conversational format. So Farah was kind enough to agree, and so I will be asking her a series of questions to cover some key points that we want to share, and then we'll open it up for your questions, and we hope that there will be audience participation tonight. So now, would you please join me in welcoming Farah Pandith to the stage and to James Madison University. All right, how we win, right? Remember that? Well, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for making the trip in the snow.
Well, listen, you guys have a lot of power to bring snow in April. I'm really impressed.
Well, it's a delight finally to get to this moment. And I thought we might start, Farah, if you don't mind, by talking a little bit more about how you came to this work. We had a chance to talk earlier today, and I know you attended a terrific liberal arts college and Smith College in Massachusetts, many of you may know. And I understand that you were not only a student leader, but the student body president, and actually at a tumultuous time as well in the institution's history. So I know Smith is a small college, it's got a great sense of community, and you've talked a lot about how communities matter as we reflect on these issues in contemporary society and how we deal with them. So can you say a little bit more about how that experience shaped you, since we're here in a university setting and we've got a lot of students listening tonight, and how you got started in this work?
Well, first of all, good evening to everyone and to those of you online. And I also want to thank you so much for this kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here in person. And really, it's been an exceptional day. I've spent the day with students. And as you rightly said, something magical happens on a college campus. Young people are learning about themselves, and they're learning about the complexity of the world and how to navigate it. And for me, when I attended Smith, it was a time that weirdly is reflected in what we are seeing in America today. There was a lot of polarization around issues of financial aid. And there were a lot of really ugly incidents that were happening across college campuses. There was a cross burning on the front lawn of Amherst College. There were things that were happening at Yale and at Berkeley. And so in that era, some really bad things happened on the campus at Smith in my junior year. And there was a lot of feelings of dismay, obviously, and exhaustion and frustration that we're dealing with issues around race and diversity when it should not be the case. And this, of course, was in the 1980s, and it should not be the case now either. But something really terrible happened. And I mention this because what it made me do was it forced me to think about what leadership was about, and it made me think about what we can do to come together as a community. And from the ugly incident that happened at Smith came an opportunity for the campus to come together and to think about who we are, to define ourselves and what we wanted to be. Was diversity important to us? Was inclusion important to us? What did it mean to be respectful of each other? Those conversations were pivotal at that time, but also something remarkable happened from that, and that I happened to have the opportunity to write a speech that was heard by the First Lady of the United States. And that speech was about diversity, and she was kind enough to invite me to the White House as a senior in college, and from there I began my career in public service.
That's an amazing moment in one's life, right? To be in college and be invited by
Incredible.
the First Lady in that way. So you obviously made an impression. So had you thought about that going into student government, or was this one of those moments that just changed your life?
There's no question that I look back on this and say, if not for that, everything else wouldn't have fallen into place. But I didn't know at the time it was going to mean as much as it did. First of all, when you're dealing with a campus that has just witnessed a terrible racial incident, there's a great deal that has to be done. And I had the ability to have a tremendous group of peers around me that were part of the student government that worked together hand in glove with the administration. That taught me some really important lessons early on. The importance of coalitions, the importance of listening, the importance of setting the tone and understanding. So all of those things were key. Those things obviously helped me as I moved on in my career. But one of the things that I like to remind people about is that our country wasn't always a place in which people asked you, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat first? And they didn't always make a decision about who you must be because of what you said to the answer to that question. Today we're in a different place, but I was the beneficiary of a First Lady, Barbara Bush, who didn't ask me, did I vote for her husband? She didn't ask me where I came from. She didn't ask me how American I was. She simply heard my words about diversity and gave me an opportunity to do something about it.
That's a great story and a reminder to our students about being open to possibilities when they come your way, right?
Yes.
And being ready when you get those opportunities.
And being yourself, I think that is really important. You can't put this on. Either you are somebody that is authentic and clear about something, whatever those issues are, if they are transferred to the people you're around, it is real. They see that. And I think for that moment in time, I knew how important it was to do the right thing when something awful had happened on campus. And I was lucky to have a group of faculty and administration who were able to think about, together with students, how do we turn this from something ugly to something great?
And I'm glad, a couple of words just to keep in mind when we talk about leadership lessons. Authenticity,
Yes.
to me, is something I talk about all the time when I teach leadership, because I tell students, you're not going to be successful in the long term if you're just trying to copy somebody else's style or personality. Be the best version of yourself that you can be.
Yes.
And everybody has the capacity to be a leader, I believe, in different ways and in different arenas, but you have to use your own personality and be true to yourself, because people respond to that.
Yes, and they can see through you.
Absolutely.
If you're not.
And then the other thing that you noted that's, I think, the most undervalued leadership skill is listening. And we're going to talk a lot about that, I suspect, tonight, about how you deal with some of these types of challenges, because so often people think of leaders as talking all the time, but actually listening is one of the most important things that we can do. So you've done all this work now, of course, at the global level. And what are some of the biggest trends you've seen around the world? I mean, you've written this book about violent extremism, and how do we address that, not just the United States, but worldwide. So can you talk a little bit about some of the trends that you saw in doing this work?
It was such a gift to be able to go into communities as a representative of the United States and talk to young people. I was really focused on people under the age of 30, to hear what they had to say. What does it feel like to grow up in a post-9/11 world? What are you experiencing? What's on your mind? What are some solutions that you have? What are things that we aren't understanding and seeing? And through that process, you would imagine that you would say, oh my goodness, in these countries in Africa, it's this way, and this part of Asia, it's that way, in Europe, it's like this. But one of the things that blew my mind was that no matter where I went on the globe, and as you said in your introduction, I traveled to nearly 100 countries. For Muslim millennials, and that's the group that I was actually focused on, the data point that connected them all was identity. So I could be talking to a young person in Trinidad and Tobago, or Guyana or Suriname, and they would be talking about questions around how it felt to be modern, or how to be Muslim. What does it mean to be Muslim? I could go to Spain or England or France and ask that question, I'd hear that. I could go to different parts of Africa or the Middle East or Asia, I'd hear that. And I walked away after hearing this over and over again, thinking to myself, there's something much bigger happening here that policymakers aren't understanding. We keep containing people to this region or this type of person. Oh, you're Egyptian, you must be like this. Oh, you're Indian, you must be like that. When in fact, it isn't regional. It's demographic. It's not the geography. And that's because these guys are digital natives. That is because they are connected to each other around the world. That was a trend on the identity that really manifested its way into the way I've thought about how to think about solutions.
Right. So your book, and I love the fact you can see in its nice big print, has a very optimistic title, right? How We Win, which suggests that we can be successful, and we, of course, care deeply about democracy in this country and freedom of thought and bringing together people from diverse backgrounds to live and work together, we hope, in peace, right? So do you really think you talk about solutions being available and affordable in the book? Can you say a little bit more about that, and do you still believe that? I know it's been a couple of years, and a lot has happened in the world recently, so.
It is an important question to ask because, when we are looking at the landscape in 2022 with a war in Ukraine, with a January 6th event in our country, with a crisis that's happening with the environment that is unprecedented. I could go on. There's some very, very important things that are shifting on top of the virus that is still a plague around the world. It is easy to think We can never get past any of this. There are no solutions to any of it. My piece of this is fighting hate and extremism, but there are some other big problems out there too. You can throw your hands up and say, this can't be done, it's too hard. And we were beginning to see some of that at the end of the Obama administration when people were saying, well, you can't deal with fighting the ideology of hate. We've always hated. People always hate each other. What are you trying to do? And my response here is this. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Am I trying to eradicate hate from the planet? I wish I could. We're not going to. That isn't the issue we're trying to solve. We are trying to so shrink the pool of people that find hate appealing, that find the us and them ideology appealing, that we can manage it. So there will be haters, there will be people who are violent extremists, yes, bad stuff, but we can contain that. But what's happened today is that we've thrown our hands up. We've been lazy on hate. We've said, it's okay, it's all right, it will always be there, social media is there, what are you gonna do? Turn it all off? I am as committed to an optimistic ending as I ever have been, because I know what millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha can do. That is why I'm optimistic.
And I love that optimism. I don't know about those of you that are here or watching by live stream, and by the way, welcome to all of you as well. But it's very easy right now, I think, when we're reading the news every day or watching it on television, right, to just feel overwhelmed,
yes.
right? And it's very tempting to sort of throw up your hands
yes.
and say, oh, these problems are just too big. And yet, you talk in the book about practical things that we can do and that individuals can do, not just government, and we'll come back to that, to make a practical difference. But I want to come back to something that you mentioned, because you talked about identity. And we're obviously in a world where you mentioned, people divide up, whether it's by political parties or other, it's almost, we call it tribalism these
yes.
days, right? How does your own identity make a difference in this work? And when you think about us versus them, I hate that phrase, right?
Yeah.
We hear it all the time. I mean, we talk here about we the people,
right?
And that means we all of the people, but can you talk about your own identity and how that's played into this work?
It's an interesting time when we see this idea of I, and I am experiencing this as opposed to we. We have a collective experience here on planet Earth together, dealing with all of these challenges that we've just outlined. And every human has so many identities, it is ridiculous to think of one-dimensional people who only are Christian or Hindu or Muslim or this, or I'm using faith as an example, but pick race, pick sexuality, pick whatever part of your identity you want to think about. I have to confess that being somebody who was not born in America, I came to the United States when I was a baby. I traveled as a young child back and forth between the United States and to visit family in Kashmir in northern India, which helped me think about the world as a bigger place. So my identity about being somebody who could navigate two worlds was established at a very young age. But interestingly, my identity around religion was never anything that I really thought about because it was so personal. I was not raised and I was not in an environment in which you sort of unpack somebody's, religion. How Christian are you? How Muslim are you? Are you a practicing? I mean, those were not terms that were ever used. That's come into the mainstream today. So the religious identity that I had was very personal. I didn't really think about it, but everything sort of converged around 9/11. And it forced me to think differently because people were thinking about me differently. And that was a shock. I'm not alone in this. You can talk to anybody who had a life before 9/11 and then after it, who happens to have an origin or story or a religion or a name or even, quote, look Muslim. You had a different experience in your life before 9/11 and afterwards. So my identity, obviously my identity didn't change, but the way people perceived me, I suddenly had people asking me questions that they would never think to ask me before. They saw me in ways that I was shocked to hear. One of the things that was most just eye-opening for me is during the book tour. I've spent the majority of my career overseas, traveling from the United States overseas, representing our country, obviously, as you heard, but I'd not spent time in the United States, being me, talking about myself. And I spent almost a full year, 2019 was really spent traveling around the United States, talking about my book. And I would go to states and gatherings where people have chosen to come to the event. It is a book talk. I am talking about the book How We Win. And people would ask me questions like, how do they let you serve in government when you're not an American? Or often, you speak English really well. Or things like that. Now, I can hear the audience. It was shocking at first because never in my entire upbringing had anybody ever said anything like that to me. And I suddenly realized, wow, not only has our nation changed, but what we think about each other has changed. And I also began to ask myself questions about, am I evaluating people with their identity of what I perceive? Am I now part of that as well? So this identity question, in the fluidity of 9/11, when I was on the road overseas talking to people, I was an American. I was representing our country. Many of the people that I interfaced with were Muslim. They were curious about the fact that you could be an American, you could be Muslim, you could be a political appointee, you could serve your nation, and they were sending you around the world to represent your country. That was the best of America. And so for me, I celebrated my many different identities. I could talk about how free it was to be comfortable being Muslim in the United States. I could talk about the fact that there are synagogues and churches and temples and mosques in the same town, and you could practice your faith freely. You could wear a yarmulke or a bindi or a cross on your neck, and nobody was going to say anything to you. I was able to talk with fluidity about those things right after 9/11 because my experience as an American told me so. When I think today about the changes that have happened in our nation, even around that most basic thing that I've just described, it troubles me. My identity will always be my identity, it's nobody else's identity, but the way in which I see that people perceive who I am because of the noise that is around, that's changed the way I talk about my identity.
So I want to pick up on a couple of strands that you mentioned there. We talked about, you mentioned that the national context and what has changed since 9/11. I'd like to come back to that in a moment. But you've also done work both in and outside of government. And you talk about this in the book. What is the role of government, the limitations of what government can do on its own, and then the role of basically everybody else, right? Including corporations, universities, other entities. Can you say a little bit about those different perspectives since you've been in government but also worn other hats?
It's really funny because when you think about government and how big it is, and you think they can solve all problems because they have this gigantic infrastructure, you realize that in dealing with the issue of ideology, you're talking about things that happen at the grassroots. You're talking about changing neighborhoods. You're talking about changing communities, and that requires you to partner with the entities on the ground. You cannot have government telling a community how to think and how to do and how to come together. You want neighbors doing that. You want to say something really bad or good happened in our neighborhood. We're going to celebrate it, or we're going to get together and try to fix that. And so it became very clear early on that in order for us to get ahead of the ideology of the bad guys, we've got to think differently. We've got to think, okay, where are the places where we can build bridges between what we understand as government and what we know are excellent ideas on the ground, and the facility of the acumen of the people who are doing the work day to day. Building that bridge is not always easy. Obviously, there are trust issues and everything else, but it is my belief that on this issue of fighting hate and extremism, the greatest strength of the US government is to be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we hear on the ground. I want to know what the local Boys and Girls Club is doing. I want to understand what the church group is saying about what they're feeling. I want to go into a community center and talk to them about what it means for their community when they hear X, Y, or Z happening, because in those conversations, you are understanding the real thing that needs to happen. And then government can and should, in fighting this stuff, say, what can we do to help maximize your idea, or who can we put you in touch with? And in the work that I did in the Bush administration and also in the Obama administration, in talking to communities, in understanding this access point that we had as government, you could connect, I was doing this on an international scale, obviously, I could connect the idea that I heard in Nouakchott, Mauritania, with the idea that I heard in Oslo, Norway. And I could say, you two need to meet each other, you're talking about the same thing, how can we put you together? And by that kind of connectivity, you can recalibrate how people are feeling and thinking about solutions. And same thing with the private sector. So we just talked about the NGO sector, same thing with the private sector. I became exasperated with the idea that the private sector just was sort of like, this is terrorism, and we have no role here, and our shareholders won't like it, and our boards won't like it. We're not going to touch this. And I would come into this conversation saying, we're talking about communities. You, company X, are saying that you care about your workers. You're saying you care about your communities. You're saying you're investing in your communities. Well, invest in making it a happy place for them to be as humans, where if you're black or you're brown or you're pink or blue or striped, it doesn't feel bad to walk down the street. Make it so that kids are learning about other faiths. Make it feel good. Most of the time, businesses, at the time when 9/11 happened and the years after, no way, no how, something shifted. Something shifted. Companies suddenly began to see the value in looking a little bit more creatively at things like ESG. The S in ESG allows us to think about the social component of investing, right? How can you invest in a community? Can you think about an anti-hate program, an anti-bullying program? Can we as a company do that? What government can do is to say, here's the data that we've collected, here's what we know is happening, here are solutions that we know happen. So you would imagine that I know we're going to talk about social media companies, but other companies, if you look at them and you say to them, if you invest in a local program by giving your pro bono money towards this community group who is trying to build bridges, you are actually investing in something that is going to make a difference to your community. We're now in a place where companies can hear that differently, and I'm really grateful for that. So the reason why this subtitle is so long is because it's not government alone, it's nonprofits. It is certainly the business sector. There's one other component I want to just sort of put a flag in, because America is the most generous country in the world with regard to philanthropy. And yet, the philanthropic dollars to fight hate have been minuscule. I don't understand it. I just don't get it. And we're becoming a more hateful society where the us and them divide is far bigger. This COVID experience has exposed what I would call the societal sinkholes in our landscape. This is the time for philanthropic dollars, to look a little bit differently about where they can invest and how they can invest.
Right. No, that's such a great point. We talked a little bit earlier about the fact, you think about the polarization in our society and what has happened in the United States and in the world, and I thought if anything could bring us together very naively, my goodness, a non-human enemy, right? A virus ought to be it.
Right.
And yet, look what happened, right? It still was a very polarized response in many respects, and not just in the United States, but in other countries too. But bringing it close to home for a minute, thinking about our own country.
Yeah.
We all saw what happened on January 6th of 2021, but it's not just January 6th, right? The rise of hatred and extremism we've certainly seen in our own country, in our own politics in so many ways. What's changed in the United States since you've been involved in this work, and what are you seeing and thinking about in our own country?
It's devastating to have to say this, but hate is rising. We know this. This is not something new. Hate is a growth industry. It's really well funded. It's very well organized. And as I said earlier, we've been lazy on hate. Yeah. If we had actually activated everything that we had, if we had gone all in when 9/11 happened, in my view, to think about how to put the antibodies into the system so that we were alert to the dangers of radicalization, to the alert to the fact America has never been perfect, obviously. We have not had a utopian experience where there was never any problems with regard to race or religion or anything. But the us and them divide is so profound right now because it's activated in a brand new way. It's turbocharged with the online dimension, which we will talk about, but nothing happens in an online space that doesn't first happen offline. Okay, it's not some magical sauce that's happening somewhere. So when I think about the changes in America, it isn't just the technology shift. It's also where we as Americans have decided to put our energy. What are our own red lines in society that we have allowed to disappear? Before, there was a sense of civility. There was a sense of decency around how you speak to the other. Not always, but the vast majority of terms and uses of putting people down wasn't done in public in the same way. Today, things have shifted. Their gate has opened. We've allowed a lot of things to happen. I use that word civility very purposefully. I think that we mistake that everybody has to agree, everything. That is not what we're talking about here. Obviously, we're in America. We are allowed to have different ideas, and on this campus especially. A university is about different ideas, but you have to know how to listen, how to engage, how to do this in a way that is respectful of the other, even if that person has an idea that is very difficult to hear. So when we've let all of these things slide alongside of something else, I talked about the money that is coming into the hate groups. I've talked about the algorithms a little bit. We will talk more about that. But the combination of all of these things has created a moment in American history that is deeply disturbing. Because if we don't inject ourselves into this fight now, it is only going to manifest in a more deliberate and dangerous way. How do we know that? Because we've seen what happens with other kinds of hate movements and what it can do in terms of radicalizing young people and others. So for me, you could look at it and suggest, we're doomed, this whole thing is over, this is terrible, but we've learned so much since 9/11 about how people get radicalized, how algorithms are used, and what you can do to prevent that from happening, that we ought to go all in and scale everything that we know. I want to say just one last thing. If you look at statistics, it isn't just us feeling like hate is on the increase. If you look at what the FBI said in 2020, we know that the number of hate crimes in America, for the first time in 12 years, just went off the charts. You look at the numbers in New York City, for example, right now, 76% increase in hate crimes just this year in what's happening. Blacks, AAPI communities, and others, for a variety of different reasons. So it isn't just what you think you're feeling, it is actually manifesting itself in daily life. And I think when I look at that data, and I know that if there's not a stop to it, and the floodgates, are left open, it will allow the bad elements in our society to think even bigger than they've thought before. And I think that this is the moment where we say enough. We know what we stand for, and we need to find ways at a community level to be able to fortify ourselves.
Well, you've mentioned social media a few times now, and maybe it would be a good topic to turn to for a moment, because our students are now digital natives, right?
Yes.
They've grown up with it. I think at some point in terms of evolution, they're going to come out of the womb with an iPhone
Yes.
attached to their hand, right? And look, it's technology has always been increasing, right? And it provides wonderful, valuable tools. And I think at the beginning, many of us thought, oh, this is a great way to stay more connected than ever. It'll bring people together. And yet, look at the statistics you
Yes.
just cited. Look what's been happening. What is going on with social media? We hear a lot now about misinformation and disinformation and the importance of information literacy, which is a skill set that we're trying to teach here at JMU, because we really want students to understand, not to take everything at face value just because it was someplace on the internet, right? But can you talk a little bit about what is going on and what can we do about it? It's not like we can get rid of it, right? I mean, we can't put the genie back in the bottle, but what's going on and what can we do?
Well, one of the things that I talk about in How We Win are the planks that underlie extremism. And one of the most important planks is technology, what I call in the book, shake Google. Google is going to give you the answers to everything. Why am I feeling sad? What shall I eat for dinner tonight? How can I be a better human? I mean, you could go in 1,000 different ways, but that Google answer is where you begin your search, and you start moving along. Some of the things are very funny and very nice, and that's really great, but some of the things are not. And it took us a long time as consumers of this technology to understand the underbelly of what all that means. It's great when Siri tells you what the weather is, but they're recording your voice. They're thinking about who you are. They're understanding your needs and your likes. I'm not going to make a statement about whether this is good or bad. I'm simply saying the consciousness has changed in America today about what technology means for our daily lives in terms of absorption of data. In addition to that, it could be worked through in a really great way. You know, you're not feeling well, you're putting these dots together, they're telling you to do something else, or it could go in another direction, which is the direction that I have seen up front and really in a very scary fashion. Many people have not understood the tricks of the algorithm and understand that it is a response to behavior. They make money when you do, you know, everybody understands the clicks. But what you're doing is you're getting a hit. Every time you get an answer, you're getting a feeling, you are getting a mood shift in your body that makes you feel good or makes you feel like you belong. When I think about the disinformation and misinformation, it is connected, and not dissimilar from this, it is connected. One, you're now trusting technology, and that trust part is important because it is connected then to when you seek information that is news or a spokesperson, because you've trusted everything else that thing has told you, you're also trusting that you got your news from something that had to be, it was on Facebook. It was on X channel, it was on my tweet, it must be real. You're not trained to understand, is that a real image? Is that a doctored image? You're not trained to understand what are the cues that I have to see, what are the signals in the way this has been delivered to me that I can tell that's a fake. Nor are we trained as society to say, okay, I heard that fact, but I'm gonna do my own homework from independent sources to confirm that when they say X, that is really X. You saw this in spades during COVID, when you heard all kinds of conspiracy theories about where the disease came from, about what was gonna cure you, stand upside down, hang from a tree, you know, eat a lollipop, whatever crazy thing you hear. I gotta believe it because I saw it, because my friend shared it with me, and that's gonna be fine. You correctly put your finger on the thing that is the main, I think, opportunity for us, which is digital literacy. How do you not only understand what is happening to you, but how do you understand what you need to do to prevent children at a very young age whose brains have not been developed yet? A human brain does not develop until the age of 24. There's a lot of space in there to think about how they're developing. What can we be doing at the appropriate age to teach them how to use this technology so that they are protecting themselves? That's a lot of work, and we've hardly begun on that journey in American public schools. Forget about at higher education, but even at the younger levels, and for parents as well. So when I think about this question, I can get very angry, and I do, with social media companies, because I think, as you rightly said, in the beginning of all of this, you know, it's for good. We can make the world a better place. We can share information, and we do in some places. But when bad actors have taken advantage of this, or social media companies have decided that the money is more important than protection, we have a problem, and that is the problem we're in today, because the genie is out. And now it is up to citizens, every human in our country, to speak with their representatives to say, either we agree with this crazy stuff or we don't. This is what we want to do to protect our children. How can we think differently about putting some red lines and some guardrails onto the technology companies so that we are building a community of new Americans who don't have the same difficulty that we're dealing with today.
Right. You know, you've talked about money in all
Yes.
of this, and obviously there are incentives
Yes.
for companies, right? They're making money from increasing the hatred that's out there, right? Getting people angry and riled up apparently is good for business
Yes.
in some ways. So it raises the question of, what does our society do about it? We've certainly seen, including right now, say in Russia, right, that they are regulating social media in some significant ways, and I don't know that that's exactly what we're looking for, but what do you do as a society? Is it government regulation? Is it just increasing that information literacy? I mean, what's in the toolkit?
There are many touch points along that journey. The most essential thing for us to be asking as citizens is, what do we value? Who are we as Americans? What is the country we want to be? And if you don't answer that value question, you can't then get to the next piece, which is how do we think about constructive ways to value freedom of expression and freedom of speech, which is what we do as Americans, absolutely. We're not going to turn into Russia or China or any other country that contains this. We believe in all of this, but it goes back to these questions of guardrails. Where are the guardrails that you put up? We have guardrails in the way in which we drive our cars. We don't let anybody do anything anywhere. We have guardrails in the way in which we've asked technology companies, forgive me for stating what I'm about to state, but with pornography, we have guardrails in place to make sure that when you are doing a Google search, you know, there are places where you can make sure that person supposedly is over the age of 18 and not a minor. We have guardrails in place with regard to showing IDs for various other things. We think about these things as society. Where are we? Who are we? What do we value? How do we protect ourselves? The same thing is true for the use of the internet, and what these companies must do to make us safer. As we talk about these things in real time, malicious actors are out there doing things to actually lure others in, and the money piece is essential because these technology companies obviously make a profit, a great profit, a supremely great profit in the work that they're doing to make sure that people are touching them 1,000 times a day. And we've got to think differently about what we say to these companies. What are the sticks that we're going to put into place? America is late to the game. We are totally late to the game. The EU, for example, has put a lot of pressure on social media companies because they have said, look, we want you to be here, but only if you live by our rules. Right. And these are the things that we want you to have in place for our citizens so that we are protecting them. It's time that America actually think differently about what it is that we must do. The future is not going to be as slow as the past. Things are going to move in a much different place. Bad guys have only accelerated what they know. They're learning from each other. I think one of the things I really want to say is I think people believe that these hate groups and movements are stagnant. Oh, they are exactly the same as they were 20. They are learning. They are learning from each other. Groups as different as the KKK and ISIS, even though they have different ideologies, they learn from each other who is successful. How have they learned how to lure people in? What are the memes that they're using? What are the tactics that they're using? They may hate the other group, but they're saying, okay, you're successful in that, I'm going to copy what you're doing. The future is much more dangerous a time period to think about with regard to these questions around technology. This is the time for us to put those guardrails on. Right.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about guardrails, but the reality is in our Constitution, we've never had, it's never been completely laissez-faire, right, in terms of any of our rights, right? In order to have free speech, there are guardrails that are needed. The same with freedom of religion or any of the other freedoms we talk about. I like to talk about rights and responsibilities that go hand in hand. And to make it very personal, you've talked about what we value. And the question I want to ask you is, so what can individuals be doing? There are some things government needs to be thinking about, some things that organizations need to be thinking about, but what about all of us? What can we do individually, knowing what you're describing is happening all around us? I want students always to develop that sense of agency, right?
Yes.
To think that there are things that you can do. So what would be in that positive way? What can we be doing to combat some of these trends?
Well, the first and most important thing is to understand the threat that we are facing. And that with that realization comes responsibility. And it is far easier to kick the can down the road and to think this is somebody else's problem. Let the government deal with it. Let the mayor deal with it. Let the governor deal with it. Let the president deal with it. This is not my problem. Right. It is your problem. These are your neighbors. These are your friends. Every single individual in your community is affected by this plague of hate and extremism. So you've got to absorb that reality, and you need to ask yourself, what can I do? You cannot boil the ocean. I understand that. But there are actions you can do in your daily lives that make a difference to even one person. And I know you know this because we all do it every day. If a kind word, being compassionate, finding a way to do something nice for somebody else may sound like Pollyanna, but I promise you that ripple effect makes a difference. When I was in government, we had a woman named Hannah Rosenthal, who was the envoy to combat and monitor anti-Semitism. I haven't even talked about the rise of anti-Semitism in our country and around the world, which is outrageous. The numbers are off the charts, and we should be ashamed, frankly. Now, Hannah's job was very different from mine. She had a congressionally appointed position to monitor and combat anti-Semitism around the world. Hannah and I were invited to come to this very big event in Kazakhstan to talk about the US position on anti-Semitism. Hannah was supposed to speak on anti-Semitism. I was supposed to speak on what they termed Islamophobia. And there were different panels going on. So Hannah and I were in Kazakhstan, and the night before the event, Hannah said to me, you know, the messenger matters. The messenger matters. Let's switch speeches. And we did not ask permission of the State Department. And we switched speeches, and we added a paragraph to the bottom of the speech that had already been cleared, which is hate, no matter who the victim is. And so the next day, the American flags are up on the table. It's time to read the speech from the, on anti-Semitism, and I stood up. And I stood up, and they thought, oh my gosh, what's wrong with her? She's the wrong speech. But I gave Hannah speech. When they talked about Islamophobia, Hannah stood up. That inspired a lot of civil society groups to say, that's all, they couldn't believe that that happened. First of all, the United States has never done anything like that before. We didn't get into trouble, obviously. It was a very good moment.
We're still here.
We're still here, right? But what civil society groups said is, we've never seen that kind of innovation. Not that, I mean, but it's all great that you did this at a conference. What are you going to do? What are you going to do about this? Now, it wasn't my job to fight Islamophobia. That wasn't the position that I was in. But Hannah and I came back to Washington, and we thought, the civil society groups are right. We have a podium here. We have a place. We have a platform. What are we going to do? So we launched a campaign called Hours Against Hate. And that campaign was, young people don't have a lot of money most of the time, but they do have, sometimes they have time. Could we ask them to donate an hour or more of their time for someone who doesn't look like them, pray like them, love like them, or live like them? And we launched this campaign thinking, okay, we'll get a few hundred hits. It went crazy around the world. We had groups from all over the globe taking on this campaign. It became so successful that the London Olympics and Paralympics took it on in 2012, and it became a partner for the Games. Why do I mention this? Because that 1 hour of time, that's walking in somebody else's shoes, it's going across the city that you live in, the town that you live in, and saying, I've never been to a synagogue. Could I come to service with you? Could I learn about something I don't know? I'm going to take an hour in my week, and I'm going to learn about something I've never heard about. It doesn't matter what you do. It is that consciousness change. So when you ask, what can one person do? Be creative. Think about what you can do. Make a difference in that moment of this special thing that we have, being able to be in the United States, being free, having a lot of opportunity available to us to think differently about bringing communities together.
This reminds me of a question I wanted to ask, which is covered in your book, so hopefully this is okay, but your mom is here.
Yes, she
tonight.
is.
Is she out here? Raise your hand.
She's somewhere. There she is. Oh, I can't even.
Good to have you with us. And you tell a story about your mom in the book, which we talked about a little bit earlier today. Do you mind sharing that?
Not at all.
It's a great example, I think, of reaching across to folks from different backgrounds and what that can look like in a very practical way.
One of the things that I outline in the book are mega solutions, macro solutions, micro solutions, and nano solutions. A nano solution is something that we've just talked about, one person making a difference. And this is a great example of how that happened. My mom is a physician. She's retired now. She ran a hospital in Massachusetts for many years. And when she retired, she left Massachusetts and went to Georgia because gardening is very important to her. She wanted to go to a place where she could garden, and we didn't, anyway, so she's there. She didn't know many people in her neighborhood when she moved into her home. But she was out in her rose garden one day, and very soon after she had arrived, and she was noticing that there was, every Wednesday, a collection of cars at one of her neighbor's house. So one day, she saw her neighbor, and she asked her neighbor, what is going on at your house every Wednesday that all these cars are coming? And her neighbor said, well, we have Bible study on Wednesday morning. And my mom said, oh, that's so interesting. What are you studying right now? And she said, we are studying women of the Bible. And my mom said, can I come? And the neighbor who was lovely. Her name is Hilda. Hilda smiled at my mom and said, "Well, I'll be right back to you. I'll let you know." And so my mom thought to herself, "Oh my goodness, I hope I didn't put this woman in a difficult position." And I am sure the church has to okay this. But the next day, Hilda came to my mom and said, "We would love you to join." That was 16 years ago. And that Bible study group is a perfect example. These are amazing women who come together to study the Bible, okay, but they're humans who care about other humans. They are compassionate, they are kind, they are loving, they pray together. In that gesture of saying to my mom, "Please join the Bible study group with us," they did exactly what I'm just describing. So I'm glad that you asked me to tell that story, but it is not a made-up story. It is the truth. Her neighbors are amazing. I know. I've spent the pandemic down there in Georgia with them. They are exactly as I described them to be.
But what a great example
Yes.
of, again, one personal interaction. It doesn't require some massive federal intervention. It doesn't require a lot of money, right? It's just...
And in that, and it's great because what they have learned, not everyone in that group had met a Muslim before.
Right.
They did not know about Islam. What that allowed them to do was to hear from my mom, to experience what it meant to be a Muslim through my mother's practice of the religion, of being open, to be able to talk about, like all of these things, and vice versa. It is so important that we can find ways to learn and converse, and to not be worried that that person is different than I am. We have nothing in common. There's no way we can talk about things. Of course there is commonality.
Well, I'm glad you made that point about sometimes being afraid to have those conversations, because one of the things we hear from students and faculty sometimes now is they're afraid to have those conversations because they don't want to offend somebody, but then it becomes a reason not to engage. And that's, of course, not what we want to happen in a university.
There are ways to, and it's a difficult time to be on a college campus. Let's not pretend it's easy. I know how hard it is for students to try to navigate through all of this. You're getting signals, obviously, online from you're nervous that somebody's going to say something and post something, but there are ways to have compassionate conversations, to even say, "I know nothing about this issue that you're talking about. Can you talk to me about this? Tell me why you think this," or tell me about your faith. Or tell me about your background, your heritage, or whatever the thing is, in a way that is kind, is not value driven, but it's open. And I think being open in tone and in manner makes a difference.
Absolutely. Well, I could talk to you all night, but I want to open it up. Let's see. It's hard to see from up here, so I know Mike and Renee are out there somewhere. Let's see. Oh, there's Mike. Okay. So we're going to need some help from you guys because it's hard to see from up here with the lighting. So I know we've got some folks that would like to ask questions and jump in. So we will be bringing microphones out. So just if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, and we'll be using microphones, obviously, since we've got people that are joining us remotely as well. So let's see. Mike, did you have a starter?
I think
we're getting them turned on.
Yeah.
So. All right.
I appreciate very much what you're saying about hate. I have two questions. What do we do with evil? I think there's evilness in our world right now and in our country. The second question is, how do you think our previous president contributed to this evil?
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the question. Those are two really important questions and difficult ones, obviously. The first I'll take on President Trump. I think the contribution, and I want to state, and I think you said this in my introduction, and I just want to say again, that while I served in government, I was a political appointee for both parties, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. So what I'm about to say is not a politically aligned jab at anything, but in my view, as somebody who has studied the growth of hate movements over the course of the last 20 years, the contribution of a president, no matter who that president is vital. The president sets the tone for our country and how we deal with things. When President Reagan introduced the word mosque into one of his speeches when he was talking about temples and synagogues and mosques and churches, it revolutionized the way the country thought about who was in our country when he said mosque. Every single president, from George Washington, including this one, all the way to President Trump, used their bully pulpit around the issue of Islam for good. They never, ever isolated Muslims or Islam in their political conversations around foreign policy or other things. They always were very inclusive. I know this, sir, because when I served in the Bush administration, we looked back at the history at all of our former presidents, how they took moments like 9/11 and others like it, in which a religion was put out there. What did they say? How did they act? What did they do? President Bush went into a mosque right after 9/11. President Bush put a Quran in the White House library for the first time in American history. President Obama, on the steps of the Capitol at his inauguration, spoke to Muslims around the world, and he said, I wanted a new beginning. I want to build a relationship based on mutual interest and mutual respect. So what I saw for 44 presidents was a consistency in elevating this idea of unity as opposed to putting people apart. When Charlottesville happened and President Trump chose to use words that described things as both sides, what he did was to suggest that it was okay to hate, to have people talk about Jews that will not replace us being okay. And in that moment changed the tone, in my view, of what presidents have done before him. So when you ask the question, sir, about what President Trump did, he changed the way in which the United States public looked at a president. He changed what was allowed to be said out loud. In my view, he opened the gate a little bit wider. And thirdly, what he did not do in terms of his decisions to be inclusive. So for example, very purposefully talking about a Muslim ban, calling it that, very purposefully speaking about immigrants in a particular way. So I only say this, sir, because I know that the architecture of our country is dependent on communities, but I also know the power of the White House platform and what a president can do if they choose. So that's your answer to one part of your question. On your question about evil, I'm not a religion major. I am not a philosophy major. There's a lot to be said about that. I do believe you when you, I do agree with you when you are talking about evil in this world, and there is evil in this world. I think that there are more of us than there are of those people who are evil, though. And I do believe that building momentum with good works can outpace evil. That's what I believe.
Thank you. Is there another question out here? You've got a hand, Renee? Okay. Over that way.
Thank you. So you keep mentioning the idea of kind of grassroots engagement and stuff, and so kind of engaging and being with people with different ideologies, other backgrounds or whatnot, but kind of on the flip side, what do you think is the responsibility of a community in kind of like calling out ideas or attitudes that are clearly not acceptable, but people like perpetrate them because they think it is? And so the flip side of saying we're not going to accept that and stuff, because that can in itself be polarizing, and so it's kind of difficult to navigate.
It is difficult to navigate, and thank you so much for that question. I think it was Alex who was there, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, it's hard to see you from the stage. You know, the president talked about how to listen and finding ways to have conversations and how important that might be. I think that communities have a critical role in all of this, because if you aren't thinking of yourself as a cohesive group, a neighborhood, this is a community here at JMU. You are neighbors with each other. You are in it together. You are experiencing life together. You should be looking out for each other. When things happen that are complex or hard to deal with, finding the way and the words to come together to talk about things sometimes without shame, without pulling yourself in a position where you are the leader of sort of this viral movement. I'm not saying but that is happening today, that people want that star moment where there's a Facebook post about them, or I called you out at this board meeting, or I did. Some of this work can be done in quiet places, in a respectful way, to give other people dignity. And I think that if we can do that in ways that can decrease the pressure and can organize ourselves in a way that's more comfortable to have conversations, we'll be in a good place. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Do we have another question out here?
There's one on the right.
Ah, okay.
So when you were talking about kind of extremism, and then we think about moderation on the other side, and I was holding that in my head, as well as the idea that there are huge problems to solve, and some of the problems need big solutions. So how do we, and I was also kind of inspired by the title of your book.
Thank you.
So how do we go about thinking, when do we try to win, and when do we accommodate in solving big problems?
I love that question. I love that question. Big ideas are important, and throwing a lot of different big ideas on the wall to see how to solve. We talked about innovation and how you can bring different kinds of people together to solve a problem. The first question I was asked today was about, and my answer was not about boiling the ocean, because we can't do that. It's understanding what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So my answer to you is very, very similar. I want creative ideas. I want big ideas. There are some amazing ideas that have not come to bear on this issue because people are too afraid to think out of the box. I want everybody to come to the table. I want to think about scale. We didn't talk about the word scale, and I'm sorry that I didn't.
Yes.
All of these micro things are great, but it's not going to make the kind of ripple change that we need unless it's scaled. So what I want to see is that in that movement, that momentum, that energy that is facilitated to do that. But what's the that? Understanding the parameters of the danger that we're in. How do we, for this particular problem of decreasing the extremism, I would say three things. First, I want fewer groups in the United States that are hate groups, that are funded and are mobilizing and are recruiting. Secondly, I want communities to think differently about the roles that they can play. This is not putting your hands up in the air saying, oh gosh, you know, the neo-Nazis are thriving, or more ISIS people are being recruited. No, it's to say, well, what can I do about it here? And what do I not know? Are there groups here that are working on this issue that I can volunteer in, or I can give money towards, or I have expertise in such and such that I can help? And then thirdly, it's putting pressure on those people that you elect in office to stand by the principles of collective decency around treating people with the kinds of things that we were talking about today. So those are three places, but scale matters. It really does matter.
And I'm glad you mentioned that word scale and scalability. One of the conversations that's happening right now in American higher education is there has been something of a wake-up call that I think a lot of leaders now are saying, we have a real problem here.
Yes.
With extremism and hate and extreme polarization. College campuses are supposed to be places, right, where we bring people together from different backgrounds, different perspectives. We don't expect to all agree. That's not the point.
Right.
It's not a university. But to your earlier point, there have to be some rules of engagement, as I call it, right? And that's where the civility comes in. And that doesn't mean just people with a veneer of politeness, but it means some modicum of human respect,
Yes.
right, that allows for those hard conversations to take place. But there are conversations happening now at the national level, and all of you should know this in case you're interested, where JMU, among others, is trying to play a more active role, and our national higher ed associations are saying, what can we do to work together within higher ed and also with others, like religious groups and businesses, to really work on these problems and to think about misinformation and disinformation and developing that cultural responsibility to talk about what we value, to talk about information literacy, and to really speak out about these issues.
We need as many touch points in the society as possible. I like the fact that you talked about religious leaders and business leaders and others, places where we don't always migrate towards because we think they don't have anything to do with us. Everybody has everything to do with us. It takes all of us to be able to deal with this threat.
Absolutely. Do we have a couple more questions out there, Mike? You've got, over in.
You seem to be very interested in women's issues, and I'm wondering how important it is for us to have a woman president and where you might take that.
What a great question. That was a softball. Thank you. I talked about different aspects of my identity. I didn't talk about my identity as a female. It is devastating to me that in the 21st century, we are still looking at policy tables that are primarily male. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand why we haven't done more. It is vitally important that we have women, not just elected leaders, but women in the pipeline as policymakers. So civil service, foreign service. I want to see pictures of meetings that are not just a whole bunch of men at a long table having conversations about what needs to be done with the state of the world. So it is incredibly important, not just symbolically, but from the practical point of view, you need as many different kind of ideas to come solve the kinds of problems that we're dealing with today. So gender matters, and thank you for asking me about that.
And a really important question, by the way, as all of you know, at a college that was founded as an all-women's teachers college, and to this day, about 60% of our students are women. So it's really important that they hear, all of us hear that message. Is there another question?
So I have the mic, but I don't want to interrupt if somebody else has a question. So I believe it was when I first met you, I became a little bit obsessed with how young people are, I guess, lured into either gangs or some of these terrorism groups. I've watched a lot of documentaries, read a lot about it. The people who tend to be vulnerable to this are not going to college. They're not going to church, right? How do we reach them? And I'm touched by something John said, we're afraid. And I don't know how anybody else feels, but we're afraid to admit that it could be our kid, our nephew, our great niece, right? It could be one of ours. So how deeply have we individually grappled with how close this may come to our family and friends? And how can we who are privileged enough to be here actually do more to reach out to folks who aren't here, but who may be vulnerable?
I love this question. I love this question. One of the things that January 6th did for our nation was there are so many bad things that happened, and this is another bad thing. It broke apart families. And for the first time in our nation, you began to hear children talk about their parents and parents talk about their kids who had been pulled down a rabbit hole of radicalization, whether it was QAnon, whatever the ideology was, where public conversations were taking place on Facebook, in the New York Times, and whatever, that said, I don't speak to my parents anymore because they have done this, or I have a sister who did that, or we've sort of outed this problem in many ways. Other kinds of extremism hasn't come that far as clearly, but that's what one of the things that outputs of January 6th has done. So what do we do about this? There are no places in America right now that are off-ramps that have been developed so that we have a really good sense of how to take these wonderful young people, let's suppose, who have been radicalized, and they can go to a place and get the kind of mental health help that they might need. I talk a lot about this off-ramp component alongside this sort of awareness factor that you talk about. You can't find the solutions unless we are opening up at society and saying how big the problem is. It's kind of like alcoholism or something else. You've got to own it first, and then you can think about what needs to happen. We need to have places in America where parents can send their children who are vulnerable, where parents who are interested in learning more about digital literacy can be given kind of curriculum to learn about these things. All of that kind of stuff is together, but we're not in that place yet, and it is extremely important that you raised it.
I you have another question out there, Mike? Or Renee?
Wait,
back.
I think we're gonna. All right, I'm already halfway here.
Do you think decreasing the problem of hatred could also help solving other problems like climate change?
Well, one of the things that we know is that we've become very, very simplistic in understanding issues. We think we understand everything. We don't listen. We don't hear what others are saying. When we're talking about climate change, the minute somebody begins to talk about the environment, a lot of people turn off and they don't want to even engage with you because they think they put you in a box in one way. Obviously, the ability for us to have dialogue and bring people under the tent is connected to what we've been talking about today. So yes, I think that there is a connection. One of the things I will say, by the way, about climate change is you might be surprised to know that many of in the research that's been done, a lot of extremist groups are using climate as a blanket opportunity and to be able to lure people onto their side. So if you're a climate denier, for example, there's certain extremist groups that will go after you in the places that you live online to be able to pull you along. So it is connected. These are overlapping things. Fighting hate in general is a great idea, but it does have a connection to things like climate, for sure.
Is there, I think one more back.
Yep, sorry. So I've been reading, reading up on your strategies on counteracting violent extremism. So I was just, and obviously these are major policy changes in the status quo. So I was wondering, what's the first step the Biden administration can do to address violent extremism in the United States?
Great question. They've already taken the first step, which was right after, 2 weeks into the administration, they began to look at what they're terming domestic extremism in a very different way. We did not have the infrastructure or the attention to develop methodologies around what do we do about this problem of people who have been radicalized in the United States towards white supremacist organizations and others. We kept defining the threat as something coming from overseas to our nation as opposed to saying something is happening here, how do we deal with it? So the plan that the Biden administration has to deal with domestic terrorism is totally brand new. It's extremely important. They've placed it front and center. They put money behind it, and that's on the positive side. Let me also say no administration has done enough to put the money where money needs to go. So having said that, I'd like to see more resources given to grassroots solutions to fight hate and extremism, to think about what we do with making sure to the question that was asked about what's happening when somebody gets radicalized, where do they go, how do we talk about it? All of those things that are appendages to this problem have to be built in our nation, and they haven't been. Money matters, attention matters, and I think that there is an interest by the American public today because they're now seeing it in their neighborhood where they hadn't before.
Great. Is there? I think we have one more up front, Mike.
Thank you. My question would be along the lines of, two-part question. One, what advice would you give students that are potentially interested in that same grassroots approach, especially in a world where grassroots approaches aren't necessarily the thing that a lot of people are focused on now? And secondly, as a higher ed institution that is focused on civic engagement and community engagement, the hands-on experience, what specific role do higher ed institutions play, specifically faculty and staff and administration, in helping students be able to find their niche in being able to do this line of work?
Great question. On the question of what do you tell students to do, how do you get involved in the community? Not wait for some magical moment when you're going to discover something you haven't seen. Go out there and look for it. If you're an art student or a music student, if you're an IR student, pick the NGO, pick the community event that is happening and think, what can I do to help on that thing that I'm interested in to actually explore these issues that we've talked about. Are there ways to build, I'm using art as an example, to have artwork that actually tells a particular story, evokes a set of music? How do you infuse into your daily experience something that amplifies these values that we've talked about? That's something you can do very, very easily. So that's what I would say. Start with the most basic stuff, but also on this campus, there are 3 things that this campus and any campus that is higher education. 1, presidents have a really important role to play in the way in which they set the tone and they set the values for a university. You happen to be really lucky to have a president who has already written and been very vocal about the values that you hold as students here. That is not the norm. It is the exception. We want presidents to do what he is doing, to go out there and say, this is who we must be as a community, and this is how we're going to live this out loud. So setting the tone is important. Secondly, how we think about the role of faculty is really important too. This is a moment of great change in the way in which people teach in the classroom for a lot of different reasons. I think that there's a lot of innovation around issues of diversity, of respect, of inclusion, of compassion, of civility that can be moved into the classroom and in the way people study. That we've got to allow faculty to think creatively about how to do this and not cut their wings, okay? And thirdly, it's the campus at large, right? It's the combination of faculty and student and staff and leadership that comes together as a community to say, are we doing enough? What is the point of being at a place like this? What's the point if you aren't thinking about what you can do? What can you do to make this place, this special place, what you want to make it? And there are so many people in this community that we've just described who have interesting ideas, who want to do more. Bring them together. Think about ways to do this, not wait.
Thank you, Farah. I think with that, I always like getting on a homework assignment, which is good, because this is a university after all, right?
Yes, exactly.
So we really appreciate your insights. I have one more thing I want to do, but can we have a hand for Farah? And thank you so much. So I have one other responsibility here tonight before we close, and it really is a great pleasure, and it's been a couple of years that we've been waiting to do this. So back in 2018, we established the Madison Award for the Public Good to recognize contributions to public well-being as reflected by our mission and, of course, the individual for whom we are named. The honoree is selected based on the following criteria. First, personification of Madisonian ideals. Second, extraordinary contributions to American civic life. Third, a distinguished record of engaged citizenship and serving the public good. And fourth, acknowledgement and encouragement of the unique role of education in protecting freedom and sustaining democratic Republican government. So as you can see from tonight's discussion, Farah Pandith is an extremely worthy recipient of the 2022 Madison Award for the Public Good. So in addition to the bust of James Madison, which is given to our Madison Visions series speaker guests, each year the recipient of this very special award will also receive an original piece of art created by JMU faculty and students. And we're about to show you a video that gives you some background on this year's piece.
I was playing off the idea of what the award's about. You know, I mean, what somebody does for the public good can be so many different things. What I ended up thinking about was showing people addressing a challenge and working together to overcome it, right? Or to get on top of it, kind of literally in this case, to get on top of it. There was a lot of conversations initially, just brainstorming the idea and sketching it out, and then we all four had a week where we could get together and all work on it more intensively. A lot of the sketches we went through for the people were about trying to find the right amount of detail, and when it got too particular in terms of, well, that's clearly a man, that's clearly a woman, take just enough out to lose the specificity without taking so much out that the figure became sort of overly abstract. These are made out of powder-coated copper. So they did all the metal work and the powder coating work on those. And then I worked on the glass parts for this. When you're talking about somebody working for the public good, you're not talking about somebody who's just, individually challenging an obstacle and overcoming it and standing on top with their hands raised in triumph. You're talking about somebody who's working to help other people get to the top of that challenge, to overcome that challenge.
So a very special thanks to Professor Mark Rooker and his students who literally created this beautiful original piece. And you can see it sitting here. I am not going to lift it up and hand it to Farah like the Academy Awards because this is actually really heavy. But it's a beautiful piece, and we hope that you'll find a prominent place to display it and that you'll always remember your visit to James Madison University when you look at it, and hopefully when many guests see it as well. But it really is a tremendous honor and a privilege for us. I'm glad we finally had the chance to meet in person, to have this moment together. And what I'd like to do, though, since James Madison is not quite so heavy, I would like to present you with this bust of James Madison as a reminder and a memento of your visit to the university. Thank you so much for the great work you've done in being the change. That's a theme that we talk about at this university all the time, the importance of each individual finding a way to be the change they want to see in the world. And you certainly have shown us how to do that. You've inspired us with your words, with your example, and the work that you continue to do. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have a photographer
here.
Thank you so much. This is really wonderful.
Well, thank you all so much for being here this evening. It's been great to be able to share this moment with you. A special thanks to everybody who came out in the midst of the snow. We hope it's going to warm up, certainly for the rest of the semester. For our students and faculty and staff, I know we have just a few weeks left here, so finish strong, as I know you will. And please, please be on the lookout for announcements about the Madison Vision Series events for the next academic year. We look forward to seeing you all again, and we hope, of course, now to continue to have these events in person. Thanks also to everybody who's joined us online and by streaming. It's been great to have you with us as well. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and go Dukes!
Thank you. Oh, you're so lovely. Thank you so much. This was great. This was really great.